From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about COVID-19 affecting children in the U.S. More than 4 million children in the U.S. have tested positive for COVID. However, the true number is likely much higher because they are often asymptomatic. Children are also less likely to be tested. At least 44,000, from newborns to 17-year-olds, have been hospitalized since last August. About 350 of them have died, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. As the school year approaches, only 43% of children in the U.S., aged 12 to 17, have received a COVID vaccine. According to Salon.com, late September is the earliest parents of 5 to 11-year-olds can expect their children to be eligible for vaccination. Currently, Pfizer is on a faster track than Moderna. Mexico filed a lawsuit against major U.S. gunmakers in a Boston court on Wednesday. The Mexican government says that the illegal cross-border flow of arms is fueling rampant drug-related violence in the Latin American nation. This kind of legal action is unprecedented for the Mexican government. The move has the backing of President Andrés Obrador, according to the country's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard. The companies named in the suit include Smith & Wesson, Beretta, Colt, Glock, Century Arms, Ruger, and Barrett. Together, they manufacture more than two-thirds of the over 500,000 weapons that are illegally brought into Mexico each year. The flow of arms generates millions of dollars in profits annually for the American gun industry. Ebrard said the lawsuit seeks compensation for the damage caused by the firm's negligent practices. But the main aim is to make the companies change their behavior. Turkey has called America's latest resettlement plan for Afghans irresponsible. This was after the U.S. referenced Turkey as a migration point where Afghans might wait months before resettlement in the United States. The scheme, which was announced on Monday, allows Afghan civil society members to come to the U.S. on their own through a third country. The Turkish government said the resettlement program can cause a great migration crisis in the region. It also says it would not undertake a new such crisis on behalf of a third country. According to the Norwegian Refugee Council, Turkey has provided protection to more refugees than any other country worldwide in the last 10 years. Tanju Bilic is the spokesperson for the Turkish Foreign Ministry. He said on Tuesday that Turkey will not accept the irresponsible decision taken by the U.S. An estimated 500 to 2,000 Afghan refugees are now entering Turkey every day. Australia's government announced today that it will pay reparations to Indigenous Australians who were forcibly assimilated as children. The federal government redress scheme is part of a $1 billion plan. It aims to reduce the sharp disadvantages faced by Indigenous Australians today. Thousands of Indigenous youths were forcibly put in foster care with white families by the government until the 1970s. This was to assimilate them into the country's European settler culture, language, and religion. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison said these assimilation policies were a shameful chapter in the country's national story.
So today I announced that the Commonwealth is investing $378.6 million in a new scheme for the stolen generations, for survivors who were removed as children from their families in former Commonwealth territories, the Northern Territory, the Jervis Bay Territory, and here in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory. The scheme will involve a one-off payment in recognition of the harm caused by forced removal, and it will give each survivor the opportunity to, should they wish, tell their story and receive an individual apology.
There are about 800,000 Indigenous people in Australia. They represent over 3% of the country's total population. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has called for solidarity among Muslims to support the Palestinian and Kashmiri causes. Speaking to a delegation of the Arab Parliament in Islamabad, he said that Palestine and Kashmir are among the root causes of disaffection in the Muslim world. He stressed the need to resolve these disputes in accordance with the resolutions of the UN Security Council and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Prime Minister Khan also called for a unanimous approach to deal with the regional and global challenges confronting the Muslim Ummah. He said Muslim countries need to act collectively to counter growing Islamophobia around the world. Dozens were injured on Wednesday when Lebanese police clashed with protesters demanding accountability for last year's port explosion in the capital city, Beirut. Protesters allegedly tried to storm the parliament's headquarters, whose members have been accused of stalling a probe into the disaster. A few hundred yards away at the port, thousands gathered to mark the first anniversary of the explosion, which killed at least 214 people and wounded 7,000. Over 300,000 people were displaced by the incident. On August 4th last year, a stock of ammonium nitrate fertilizer haphazardly stored at the city's port exploded. This left swaths of the Lebanese capital looking like a war zone. 1 year on, no senior official has been held to account. Human Rights Watch has issued a 127-page-long investigative report of the incident. It provides evidence incriminating senior Lebanese officials in the explosion. Senegal is now facing an explosion of COVID-19 cases. Until recently, the West African country had been largely spared from the worst of the coronavirus pandemic. The spread of the virus's Delta variant changed that. Now in the capital city of Dakar, the health system is on the verge of breaking down. Overall, Senegal recorded over 59,000 COVID infections since the start of the pandemic and more than 1,000 deaths. But official cases have risen quickly. Authorities recorded between 600 and 750 cases a day this week alone. The city's cemeteries are under pressure as the latest wave of the pandemic spreads. The largest cemetery in Dakar is handling 3 times more burials than normal. And patients are being turned away because of a lack of oxygen in hospitals. Senegal is a nation of 16 million, with Muslims making up 96% of its population. Authorities in Wuhan, China say they will be testing the city's entire population of 12 million for COVID-19 as it battles its largest outbreak in months. This is after the first domestic cases of the virus's Delta variant were confirmed on Monday. The Delta strain has also been found in a few provinces and big cities, including the capital Beijing, over the past 2 weeks. Coronavirus first emerged in Wuhan more than a year ago. The city is now confining residents of entire cities to their homes and cutting transport links. The fast-spreading Delta variant is challenging China's zero-COVID strategy and its homegrown vaccines. The Delta variant first emerged in India, where the first case of infection with it was identified last December. China on Wednesday tightened overseas travel restrictions for its citizens as part of efforts to contain rising COVID cases. Deadly wildfires reached a Turkish thermal power plant and its surrounding town on the Aegean Sea, sparking evacuations on Wednesday. The wildfires have ravaged Turkey for the past week, engulfing the country's outer edge. The Turkish Defense Ministry said it was evacuating villagers as bright balls of orange flames tore through the hills encircling the plant. The ministry said a third firefighting team from Azerbaijan, with 1 jet, 40 fire trucks, and 160 personnel, are set to arrive in Turkey today. In neighboring Greece, wildfires continue to approach the capital city of Athens. At least 150 houses have been destroyed by a raging fire that surrounded a monastery and a dozen villages on the Greek island of Evia. It is just one of over 100 blazes burning in the heat wave-hit country. Meanwhile, after historic floods, Germany is grappling with mountains of debris. Waste centers are struggling to sort a pile equivalent to a whole year's worth of refuse. Along the roads that lead to the valley, mud has turned to dust. Convoys of dump trucks have replaced the tourists that used to enjoy the picturesque surroundings. The group Muslim Rights Concern of Nigeria has demanded that the Nigerian government declare every first day of the Islamic calendar a holiday. Muslims in Nigeria will join their fellow faithful around the world to mark Hijrah Day next Monday on August 9th. That is the first day of the Islamic year 1443. The Islamic calendar follows the lunar cycle. In a statement, the organization said the Nigerian government has ignored several calls and demands by Islamic organizations to declare this day a holiday. About 400,000 women get raped or sexually assaulted every year in the United States. In India, it is the lower caste who are the #1 victims. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
Delhi is being called the rape capital of the world, but that title does not tell the story. The Hindu caste system is legal in India. Brahmins of the highest caste are the dominant caste. Priests and leaders come from this caste. The lowest in the hierarchy are literally the outcasts of India. They often cannot fetch water from a common source. This is where a 9-year-old made her deadly mistake. She went to a close-by crematorium to fetch cold water to drink. She is born into a Dalit caste, the so-called untouchables of India. She never came back. When her mother went looking, a Hindu priest at the crematorium started making excuses. She was electrocuted, he said. He told her, I will give you money. You will not be able to fight the case. He also misled her mother by asking her not to report to the police to avoid organ harvesting by doctors. Upon her mother's insistence, they let her see the girl. She was lying lifeless, recounted her mother. There were bruises on her body and her clothes were wet. The priests and his associates meanwhile locked the gates of the crematorium and forcibly cremated the girl despite protests from the helpless mother. Parents say she was raped by the priest and 3 other employees. Then later they killed the little girl. Then without the knowledge of her parents, she was burned into ashes. They hoped that the evidence of rape dies with her. This type of gruesome incident often happens in India. Most cases are never registered. Dalit protesters blocked the road. They burned an effigy of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Delhi Chief Minister. India is considered one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. The Indian government's data from last year says a woman is raped every 15 minutes in the country. An overwhelming number of victims are the Dalits.
Not many people know that one of the closest colleagues of Nelson Mandela was a Muslim. Ahmed Kathrada spent more than 26 years of his life in prison with Nelson Mandela. More details about the South African anti-apartheid icon with Ali Khalaf.
To brush up on his shooting abilities.
When we think of the anti-apartheid struggle, we think of Nelson Mandela. The South African Muslim community was also an integral part of that freedom struggle. Ahmed Kathrada, a close friend of Nelson Mandela, was also a Muslim. Ahmed was born in the small country town of Schweitzer Reneke in western Transvaal. His parents migrated from Surat, Gujarat, to South Africa. Ahmed was jailed for life on June 12, 1964, along with Nelson Mandela, amongst others. He was one of the prisoners of Robben Island. Ahmed was released on October 15, 1989. In 1994, he became a member of parliament in the first South African democratic elections. He also served as Mr. Mandela's parliamentary councillor. He authored a book, No Bread for Mandela, Memoirs of Ahmed Kathrada, prisoner number 46864.
And not what other people are saying.
The foreword of his book was written by Nelson Mandela himself. He strongly opposed President Jacob Zuma's corruption. He died in Johannesburg on the 28th of March, 2017. Zuma, however, ordered the South African flag to be flown at half-mast to mark Kathrada's death. He postponed a cabinet meeting in order to allow cabinet members to attend the funeral. Kathrada supporters affectionately called him Uncle Kathy.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
To get inside each other's minds, walk a mile in my shoes, walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. On this day 2 years ago, India's Hindu nationalist government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, scrapped occupied Kashmir's special status. To discuss the current situation, let's go to Henna Zuberi. Over to you, Henna.
Today marks 2 years since India's unilateral and illegal actions of August 5th, 2019, in Indian-occupied Kashmir. We've witnessed unprecedented oppression of Kashmiri Muslims by Indian occupation forces. To talk more about this, we're going to go to London, where we're joined by Muzammil Ayub Thakur, the president of World Kashmir Freedom Movement. Welcome, Muzammil.
Thank you for having me.
So it's been 2 years. For those in our audience who do not know what happened 2 years ago, please let's go over the events of August 5th, 2019.
2019, August 5th, India illegally annexed Indian-occupied Kashmir. They turned Kashmir from a de facto occupation to a de jure occupation by tampering with the constitution. Kashmir was already a disputed territory. It is considered to be an occupied territory. United Nations Security Council resolutions are testament to that. However, India unilaterally decided to abrogate Article 370 and 35A, which gave some kind of temporary autonomy, even though that it was mostly some kind, like a gift wrapping. It wasn't exactly anything serious, but there were certain objectives in Article 370 and 35A, which allowed the people's land to remain with themselves, as in the people of Kashmir owned their own land. By abrogating 370 and 35A, Indian government have now given an open ticket to any Indian to not only reside in Kashmir, but to buy land in Kashmir, essentially being able to force demographic change and settler colonialism and implement settler colonialism inside Indian-occupied Kashmir. Essentially change the demographics, remove the Muslims, and implant Hindus.
So, and demographic change is one big major part of this action. What are some other effects that this abrogation has had on the people of Kashmir?
We've seen a lot of psychological trauma that's happened on the people inside Kashmir. Immediately after August 5th, and in fact, actually on the day of August 5th or the night before, the Indian government, they blanket banned all forms of communication. There was a media blackout, a complete curfew where nobody was able to move outside. And they had arrested most of the people on the ground that could have potentially caused disruption. So we're not talking about just the major political leaders, the resistance leaders, but even children as young as 8 years old, traders, daily wagers, people that were running restaurants and hotels. They were picked up. More than 20, there was a report by an Indian women's collective that reported close to 20,000 people, especially young people, were picked up in the middle of the night, just in case that they would protest against India's illegal abrogation. But since then, we've seen so many different things. We've seen the fact that communication, not only has there been the longest communication blackout in history. This is not me saying this. There is documented evidence to state that Kashmir faced the longest communications blackout and internet blackout in history. We've seen the local media being tampered with and forced to narrate, or rather have the narrative of the Indian government. We've seen people's education suffering in the last 2 years. We've seen the economy, billions of dollars worth of damage to the economy of an industry inside Kashmir. So we've seen a lot of these things, but more importantly, human rights atrocities. We've seen people being murdered. We've seen people go to jail for nothing. We've seen people being arrested, human shields, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Now we're seeing settler colonialism and demographic change. We've seen women, or rather heard about women that have been prevented from going to the hospital, that they were pregnant and prevented from going to the hospital for delivery, and were forced to give birth on the side of the road outside the hospital because the Indian military wouldn't allow them in. We've seen the protests where they have used live ammunition against people. We've even seen people that have been martyred, and the people that and their families that are trying to bury them in the Islamic tradition. They were prevented from burial, and a lot of people had to be buried in their back gardens. So we've unfortunately witnessed some of the worst forms of crimes against humanity inside Indian-occupied Kashmir. But let us also remember that this is not limited to the last 2 years. It is an extension of what India has already done for the last 70 plus years.
Many in our audience may not even know where Kashmir is or what the history is of the people of Kashmir and what their demands are. So could you share with us a little bit about the history? I know it's hard to do so in a short time, but just some salient points.
In a very short summary, I'll say that post-partition, so when the British Raj left the subcontinent and they were divvying up between the Muslims and the Hindus, naturally the Muslim majority states were supposed to go with Pakistan and the Hindus were supposed to remain in India. Kashmir was a Muslim majority state. Naturally, at that time, it was supposed to go with Pakistan. It didn't. India decided to occupy that territory and wouldn't allow the people to decide their own fate. We had a Maharaja who was Hindu, and he obviously contributed to part of that problem. But here's the thing. Since then, we've had the United Nations Security Council resolutions, and it was India that took the issue of Kashmir to the United Nations when Pakistan were disputing India's actions in Kashmir in 1947. And the resolutions state that the people of Kashmir should be given the right to decide, a plebiscite, the right of self-determination. It is an inalienable right for every human, the same right that was given to the people of East Timor, South Sudan, and even in Scotland, they were also given a referendum. So there is no reason that for more than 70 years that we have been denied that right to self-determination. But more than that, the people of Kashmir have, because of the lack of political will in the international world, there is not enough attention being given to the people of Indian occupied Kashmir. And the problem is this. You cannot occupy a territory indefinitely, irregardless of historical facts and what the Indian narrative is and the inaccuracies that they have, be it regarding the accession, the instrument of accession, which is widely disputed by historians and academics alike. The reality is, at that time, whether we like it or not, the decision was between India and Pakistan. And right now, the people of Kashmir need to be given that decision, irrespective of what it may be. Even if they want to be with Mongolia and China, that is not a problem. But it is not Pakistan, it is not the people of Kashmir that are denying ourselves or our people the right to decide. It is India that has consistently, for more than 70 years, denied the people the right to self-determination, not allowing the people to hold that plebiscite. And that is the history of Kashmir. It stems from the partition, and it concludes with the United Nations resolutions telling India to hold that plebiscite inside Kashmir.
So what can now people who are concerned about human rights, about religious freedom, because you just mentioned, and this is a point that often isn't brought up, religious freedom is an issue over here as well. If people are not being allowed to bury according to the methods prescribed in their faith, this is a religious freedom violation, and we don't often hear about religious freedom violations of Kashmiris. Could you expand on that a little bit?
The problem with Kashmir right now, and even historically, is we never made this into a religious problem. It wasn't the people of Kashmir. It wasn't the Muslims of Kashmir. It was the radical Hindutva regimes, successive governments inside India that turned this into a Hindu-Muslim problem. It wasn't us that started this. And now we are seeing the BJP, backed by the RSS, its parent organization, a right-wing, neo-colonial, fascist regime that want to implement Hindutva. Now, what is Hindutva? It is their vision of Akhand Bharat, a pan-Hindu nation, that one party, one rule, one religion. And we've seen this before. We've seen this with Nazi Germany. And it's not a coincidence. RSS, which is, of course, the parent organization of the BJP, founded in the 1920s, took inspiration from Nazi Germany. It is in their literature. It is not me saying this. It is not some random document that I found on the internet that is saying this. It is their own literature that states this, that they want to create a pan-Hindu nation. And because of that pan-Hindu nation, or that concept of that pan-Hindu nation, they've used Kashmir as a laboratory experiment over many, many years. And since 2019, since abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, we are seeing India implementing those projects. And we are seeing the fact that our land is now being sold off to Hindus. 400-year-old Shalimar Bagh and Nishad Gardens have been sold off to Hindus. We've more than 3 million domicile certificates, which essentially means that Hindus can come into Kashmir and take our land. They can reside in our territory. And more than that, the masjids are going to become mandirs. Urdu and Kashmiri, our natural language, is going to turn into Hindi and Sanskrit. And the lands that I was talking about, we've seen the BJP in mainland India talk about exhuming the dead bodies of Muslim women. They will start exhuming the dead bodies of Muslims inside Kashmir, and they will use that land to do God knows what, desecrate that land by building their own temples and whatnot. And if you want proof of that, we have seen that with the Babri Masjid in India. So these are not theories. These have already been presented to us in their documents, in what is happening inside India, the way that the minorities have been treated inside India. And those minorities themselves have been treated this way simply because the Indian government have used Kashmir as a testing ground to see what they can do. And they've started to export those trials to mainland India. We're seeing the consequences of that now. If we do not act now, we do not ask the international community to intervene, we will see not the rise of fascism, but the expansion of fascism.
And as you mentioned, the political will of the people, of the international community, we saw this. I mean, the Security Council right now is headed by India. The Indian ambassador this morning at the last moment did not meet with civil rights organizations, precisely because today Kashmir would have been brought up. Now, one thing that has happened that has been sort of a good move, and we've seen movement in the Kashmir issue, has been this rise of young people, the next generation of Kashmiris, activism, where you've seen a lot more enthusiasm on the streets and young people talking about this issue. But then there's also an accusation against recent activism by next-gen Kashmiris, is that you all are progenies of yesteryear's generation activists. You've been groomed in US and the UK, but are either not related to Kashmir or have no thorough understanding of the intricacies accompanying the issue, quote unquote. How do you respond to that?
I could speak about this for hours, but I will refer you to that document, the fake Disinfo Lab document, that the 100-page dossier against people like myself and others, and the accusations that we have a lack of understanding and we're, not connected, and more importantly, that there is some form of nepotism going on. 2 points. I refer you to the BJP. I refer you to Rahul Gandhi. I refer you to other political parties inside India that are making these accusations. They should first introspect, number one. Number two is that we have inherited this movement. There is no nepotism here. We are part and parcel of our land. We have suffered. I was born in exile. I have personally suffered myself. My family members suffer because of me. So it's very personal to us. And the fact that we have any interest in our community, in our religion, in our homeland, should be an inspiration for other people, that even though that we are so many miles away, that we still bleed for Kashmir, that we still have aches for Kashmir, that we still are working for Kashmir, irregardless of who my father was or who other people's fathers were. We stand not because of them, but because of our principles, because of our beliefs, and because of our convictions.
Thank you, Muzammil, for your time and for being here with us today on Muslim Network News.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Henna. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3.
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Over 50% of Americans disapproved of how President Joe Biden handled the latest crisis in Palestine, while over 47% approved. In one of our previous shows, we shared the findings of a University of Maryland survey. Its author is joining Imam Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. We have today Professor Shibli Dalhami. He's professor at the University of Maryland and a non-resident scholar at Brookings Institutions. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Professor.
My pleasure.
So, what are the findings of your survey?
Well, that's interesting. I have been doing a polling on American public opinion toward the Middle East for decades, 3 decades to be specific, and I had a center for public opinion polling. And one of the questions we have asked in general had to do with whether the public wants the U.S. to lean toward Israel, the Palestinians, or be neutral. So we have been tracing this for a long time. This is not a new question that we asked, but we thought we would repeat some of those questions after the recent Gaza war in May, and to see whether there's been a shift. Now, what we have done over the years, and I've written about this many times, we have seen a shift that has taken place over the past decade, where more and more Democrats were shifting away from wanting the U.S. to lean toward Israel. Either they want the U.S. to be more neutral, the overwhelming majority, in fact, or increasingly they want the U.S. to lean toward the Palestinians. This has been a function of a number of things. One is demographic shifts that has taken place within the Democratic Party. It was paralleled by a demographic shift on the Republican Party with an increasing number of evangelicals who want Israel, the U.S. to lean toward Israel. So there's been a polarization in American politics, and Israel has been increasingly seen as a Republican issue rather than Democratic issue, with more Republican support and less Democratic support. But what we have seen here, or we tried to see, is if Gaza itself, particularly with the massive bombings in Gaza, with the over 200 civilians getting killed in Gaza, as well as a dozen Israelis killed, whether that had an impact on democratic perceptions beyond the trends that we have seen. And our conclusion is yes. In fact, what we have seen is a rather surprising shift, a large shift, particularly among young Democrats who are 18 to 34. An increasing number want the U.S. to lean toward the Palestinians opposed to Israel. In fact, among those who want the U.S. to lean toward one side or the other, who are a minority overall, among young Democrats, the ratio is 4-1 favoring the Palestinians over Israel. That is really remarkable in historical perspective. And one of the reasons why we see that is when you ask Americans who they blame for the Gaza war, what you find is that Republicans blame Palestinians more, but Democrats blame Israel far more than they blame Palestinians, and about half of them blame both sides equally. So the blame is more on the Israeli side than the Palestinian side, in contrast to the White House, which had taken a position that was decidedly pro-Israel during the crisis, not very much in harmony with the Democratic constituency. And therefore, we saw this having a real interesting consequence where nearly 30% of Democrats were disapproving, and almost half of the young Democrats disapproving of a Democratic president's behavior. You have to contrast this by understanding that overall approval of the president among Democrats has been overwhelming. Only fewer than 10%, often 5-6% disapprove. So this is a big chunk that has actually affected the president's overall approval rating.
So most Americans, not just Democrats, but most American, your survey is saying disapprove of Biden's handling of recent Gaza crisis. Could it be that some Republicans who are not satisfied that he hasn't done enough for Israel are also part of it?
Yes, of course. Many Republicans who disapprove of the president may have disapproved because he's not pro-Israel enough, for sure. Because Republicans want the U.S. to be very pro-Israel. But keep in mind that this can't be the reason why we have this shift overall. If you look at the president's approval among Republicans, broadly, not on Israel, Palestine, just in general, what is the national approval rating of the president among Republicans? Usually it's between 8 and 12% approval among Republicans. On this issue, you had 20% approval among Republicans of the president. So the shift that we see, that is the overall disapproval of the president's ratings on Gaza, is almost entirely a function of Democratic constituency disapproval, not a function of anything new coming from Republicans.
Did you had any question in your survey about how many people actually are following up with what is happening in the Middle East?
Well, we don't have the question of follow-up, but we have a question of this particular issue. Yes, we do. I mean, we ask, have you followed this issue closely or not? We find about half who say they follow it reasonably closely. And among those who follow the issue reasonably closely, in fact, the disapproval rating of the president is even higher, including among Democrats. So, in fact, I think the more people seem to have followed the Gaza crisis issue, the more they were likely to disapprove of Biden's handling.
Do you think this time media coverage of attacks on the occupied Palestine made any difference in the public opinion?
Well, I think so. I think the truth of the matter is we can always criticize the media. I think the media, a lot of it tries to do a decent job. What happened is that there's been a transformation taking place. Obviously, our media is polarized, on every issue, domestic and international. So whether you're Fox News watcher or MSNBC watcher, or you're a reader of New York Times or reading the Wall Street Journal, you might have different opinions depending on where the news is coming from. Social media has had an impact for sure, but there's no question that over time, there has been a lot more coverage of the Palestinian side of the story in some media. We've seen the New York Times coverage, for example, of Gaza was extraordinary. There's been this story that humanized all the Palestinian victims, the children who were killed, a front page story. So there's always, of course, coverage of the Israeli side that has been consistent. But I think we've seen a lot more coverage of Palestinians suffering, a little bit more humanization taken place in some important media outlets, not universal. And obviously, it is polarized media, just like the rest of our politics. But I think there's been a far more information available. Social media has obviously impacted this debate quite a bit. And that's where a lot of the young people go, frankly. They go to the internet and social media.
What do you think accounts for the young Democrats, especially having a critical opinion of Biden when it comes to Palestine and Israel conflict?
Well, I mean, the young people, there's more than one story here. I think what we've seen on Israel-Palestine is that increasingly it's become a values issue. Our politics is split along values anyway. We, on the one hand, even our democracy is now a matter of debate between Republicans and Democrats, or I should say Trumpists and non-Trumpists, because I think obviously that's even a better divide. But we have a values war here taking place. So on the one hand, the principle of democracy, human rights, international law, rule of law, basically, and Democrats have, basically mobilized around this broader theme of values. And in this context, Israel-Palestine is increasingly seen through this values war. And I think in some ways, the rise of Black Lives Matter movement has galvanized more Democrats to see Israel-Palestine through the prism of social justice, a lot more than geostrategic conflict. And in that sense, there's a lot more sympathy, especially among young Democrats, with the Palestinians that we have seen taking place.
Let me ask you this. Is the critical race theory, which is being focused of a whole lot of pro-Trump supporters, has anything to do how young people are raised, more aware of oppression of different racial groups?
Well, it's really hard to know. Remember, we're still talking about mostly young Democrats, and certainly young Democrats have shifted, and they're more progressive, if you want to use that term, broadly, not just on Israel, Palestine, and see this through the prism. And Trump has accelerated the process. We've even seen, in my previous polling, I have an article saying how Trump made Americans like Muslims more. And this seems like a kind of a puzzling conclusion. But in fact, what happened in the polarized era of Trump is that people on the other side of the issue, people who don't like Trump, his opposition or highlighting animosity toward Muslims galvanized Trump opponent in favor of Muslims. And we've seen that I've shown the polling from the rise of Trump all the way to the end, where increasingly Democrats became more and more, having more and more favorable views of Muslims, and it's a reaction to Trump, especially young Democrats. But interestingly, in a recent poll I did, and I have written an article just last month, published also by Brookings, on how young evangelicals are shifting away from Israel. As you know, evangelicals broadly are probably the most supportive of Israel constituency in the United States, more than Jewish Americans. And young evangelicals, it turns out, are also shifting away. And while we don't have a full explanation for it, I speculate on a number of things, including the fact that the young evangelicals are also increasingly seeing this issue through the prism of social justice.
Professor Talhami, since you are doing this survey for years, where do you think this trend going to lead?
Well, the question, there's really more than one issue here. There's public opinion. The question is, does it matter for politics, right? This is really the big issue. And historically, it was thought that, not enough people prioritize Israel-Palestine to make a difference. So people may have an opinion that's sympathetic to the Palestinians, but then when they vote, that's not really an issue that matters to them, and therefore politicians can ignore them. So what we have seen over time is a significant gap between elected officials, including on the Democratic side, and public opinion of grassroots Democrats. That has been the case. But what we have seen recently is this is catching up with politicians, certainly in primaries. There are some exceptions to the rule that we've seen in Ohio recently, but in fact, members, Democratic representatives who ran and made an issue of supporting the Palestinians and made Israel-Palestine an issue for them, seem to have won. And more of them, including in New York and Michigan and Minnesota and other places. So it is catching up. The gap is, in fact, declining, not to the point where there's been a transformation. Because I think, obviously, public opinion is only one element of American politics. Campaign contributions, lobbies, all of these matter a lot. And I think on that score, Palestinian support lags.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Talhami, for being with us at the Muslim Network TV.
My pleasure.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.